How are you? Everyone sleeps except you and me. I'll tell you a bedtime story. I used to work the night shift at a small roadside motel just outside a quiet town. It wasn't the kind of place people stayed for vacations. Most of the guests were just passing through: truck drivers, tired travelers, people who needed somewhere cheap to sleep for a few hours before getting back on the road. I usually worked alone. The lobby was small, just a front desk, a couch that nobody really sat on, a vending machine humming softly in the corner, and a long hallway that led to the ground floor rooms. At night, the place felt different, not scary at first, just quiet in a way that felt almost heavy. After midnight, the highway traffic would die down, and the only sounds left were the occasional car driving past outside and the old air conditioner rattling behind the desk. I actually liked the job in the beginning. I'd bring a book or watch videos on my phone while waiting for late check-ins. Most nights, nothing happened, but there was one thing about that motel that always felt strange. Room 12. It was at the very end of the hallway, and according to the booking system, it was almost never rented. At first, I didn't think much about it. Some rooms in older motels just sit empty if they need repairs or cleaning. But one night, maybe 2 weeks after I started working there, I noticed something odd. I was checking the room status on the computer behind the desk. Every room had a little label next to it: occupied, reserved, or vacant. But when I glanced down the hallway, I saw light under the door. Just a thin line of yellow light. I stared at it for a moment. Then I checked the screen again. Still vacant. I assumed housekeeping must have forgotten to turn the light off. It happens. So I grabbed the master key and walked down the hallway. The carpet was old and soft, so my footsteps barely made any sound. As I got closer to the door, I noticed something else. The light under the door wasn't steady. It flickered slightly, like a television was on inside. I stopped right outside the room. For a few seconds, I just listened. Nothing, no voices, no movement, just silence. I knocked lightly. "Hello, front desk." No answer. So I unlocked the door and slowly pushed it open. The room was completely dark. No television, no lights, no one inside. I stood there for a second, confused, because I knew what I saw from the hallway. That thin line of light under the door had definitely been there. But now, the room looked like it hadn't been used in weeks. The bed was perfectly made. The curtains were closed. The air smelled stale, like a room that had been sitting empty for a long time. I stepped inside and flipped the light switch. Nothing happened. The bulb above the bed flickered once and then stayed off, so I turned around, stepped back into the hallway, and locked the door again. When I walked back to the front desk, I told myself it was probably just the hallway light reflecting under the door somehow. Old buildings do weird things with light. I didn't think about it again that night, but the next shift, it happened again. Around 2:30 in the morning, I looked down the hallway out of habit, and there it was. That same thin line of light under room 12. This time, I didn't go check. I just stared at it from the desk for a while. Something about it made me uncomfortable in a way I couldn't explain. It looked exactly like a television glow, soft, flickering, like someone inside was sitting in the dark watching something, but the booking screen still showed the room as vacant. Eventually, the light disappeared on its own. One moment, it was there. The next moment, the hallway was completely dark again. After that, I started noticing other small things. Sometimes, when I walked down the hallway late at night, I'd hear a faint sound coming from that end. Not loud, just something subtle, like fabric shifting or someone slowly moving around inside a room. But every time I checked the system, room 12 was still listed as empty. One night, I even asked my manager about it. She looked at me strangely for a moment and then said something that stuck with me. "Oh, that room." That was all she said at first. Then she just shrugged and told me not to worry about it. "It's probably just the wiring," she said. But the way she said it didn't sound convincing. And after that conversation, something about the motel started feeling different, because once I started paying attention, I realized the light in room 12 wasn't random. It always happened at almost the same time, between 2:20 and 2:40 in the morning, every night, like something inside that room followed a routine. And the longer I worked there, the more I started feeling like the room wasn't as empty as the system said it was. The worst night happened about a month later. It started like any other shift, quiet, slow. Around 1 a.m., I made myself a cup of coffee from the little machine behind the desk and sat down to watch something on my phone. The hallway lights were dim, and the motel was completely silent. Then around 2:30, I heard something new, a sound I hadn't heard before, a door handle turning. It came from the end of the hallway, room 12. At first, I thought maybe a guest had accidentally been given the wrong key and was trying to get inside. But then I remembered. The room wasn't supposed to have anyone in it. The handle turned again, slowly. And then the door creaked open. I could hear it from the desk, just barely. A long, quiet creak echoing down the hallway. I looked up And that's when I realized something that made my stomach drop. From where I was sitting, I couldn't see the door, but I could see the wall next to it. And on that wall, I could see a shadow, a tall shadow, standing in the hallway, perfectly still. I used to work the night shift at a small roadside motel just outside town. The place wasn't fancy. It sat right next to a long stretch of highway that felt almost empty after midnight. During the day, a few travelers would stop by, but at night, the world outside the windows seemed to disappear. Most of my shifts were quiet. The lobby had a soft yellow light that made everything look older than it was. Behind the desk, there was a small computer, a metal rack with room keys, and an old coffee machine that made a slow, bubbling sound every time it warmed up. I was usually the only person awake in the entire building. At first, I liked that. The silence made the hours feel calm. Sometimes I'd scroll on my phone. Sometimes I'd just sit and listen to the faint hum of the vending machine in the corner. But after a few weeks, I started noticing something about the hallway. At the very end of it was room 12. It looked exactly like every other door in the motel. But for some reason, that room was almost never rented. I didn't question it at first. Older motels always have 1 or 2 rooms that stay empty for maintenance or repairs. One night, sometime after 2 in the morning, I glanced down the hallway while I was sitting behind the desk. That's when I noticed a thin line of light under the door of room 12. It was faint, but clearly visible against the dark carpet. I remember staring at it for a moment, because something about it didn't make sense. According to the booking system, the room was vacant. No one had checked in, and no key had been taken from the rack. I figured housekeeping must have left the light on, so I grabbed the master key and walked down the hallway. The building was quiet enough that I could hear the soft rustle of my own clothes as I moved. When I reached the door, the light under it flickered slightly, almost like a television was on inside. I used to work the night shift at a small roadside motel just outside town. The place wasn't fancy. It sat right next to a long stretch of highway that felt almost empty after midnight. During the day, a few travelers would stop by, but at night, the world outside the windows seemed to disappear. Most of my shifts were quiet. The lobby had a soft yellow light that made everything look older than it was. Behind the desk, there was a small computer, a metal rack with room keys, and an old coffee machine that made a slow, bubbling sound every time it warmed up. I was usually the only person awake in the entire building. At first, I liked that. The silence made the hours feel calm. Sometimes I'd scroll on my phone. Sometimes I'd just sit and listen to the faint hum of the vending machine in the corner. But after a few weeks, I started noticing something about the hallway. At the very end of it was room 12. It looked exactly like every other door in the motel, but for some reason, that room was almost never rented. I didn't question it at first. Older motels always have 1 or 2 rooms that stay empty for maintenance or repairs. One night, sometime after 2 in the morning, I glanced down the hallway while I was sitting behind the desk. That's when I noticed a thin line of light under the door of room 12. It was faint, but clearly visible against the dark carpet. I remember staring at it for a moment, because something about it didn't make sense. According to the booking system, the room was vacant. No one had checked in, and no key had been taken from the rack. I figured housekeeping must have left the light on, so I grabbed the master key and walked down the hallway. The building was quiet enough that I could hear the soft rustle of my own clothes as I moved. When I reached the door, the light under it flickered slightly, almost like a television was on inside. I knocked gently. Front desk, nothing, no footsteps, no voice, no movement at all. After a moment, I unlocked the door and pushed it open. The room was completely dark. The bed was made perfectly. The curtains were closed. The air smelled stale, like the room hadn't been used in days. There was no television on, no lights, no one inside. I stood there for a few seconds, trying to understand what I had just seen from the hallway. Then I stepped back out, closed the door, and locked it again. On my way back to the desk, I convinced myself the light must have been a reflection from somewhere, maybe from the hallway lamps or a passing car outside. It seemed like the most reasonable explanation. But the next night, it happened again. I looked down the hallway and saw the same thin strip of light under the same door. This time, I didn't go check. I just watched it from the desk. The glow had a strange rhythm to it, softly brightening and dimming, like someone inside was watching television in a dark room. Except I knew the room was empty. After a while, the light slowly faded away, leaving the hallway dark again. Things like that kept happening over the next few weeks. Sometimes I'd hear faint sounds coming from that end of the hall, nothing loud enough to clearly identify. Just subtle noises that made the silence feel heavier. Once, it sounded like fabric shifting. Another time, it sounded like someone slowly walking across carpet. Whenever I checked the system, room 12 was still marked as vacant. Eventually, I asked my manager about it. She paused for a moment when I mentioned the room. Not long, but long enough that I noticed. Then she simply told me not to worry about it. She said the wiring in that part of the building was old and sometimes caused strange electrical problems, lights flickering, sensors turning on by themselves, things like that. Her explanation sounded normal, but something about the way she said it felt rehearsed. After that night, the hallway never felt the same to me again. Before, it had just been quiet. Now it felt like the kind of quiet where someone might be standing just out of sight. I tried to tell myself that I had imagined the shadow. Night shifts can play tricks on your eyes, especially when you're tired and staring at the same hallway for hours. But a few nights later, the light under room 12 appeared again. It was a little after 2 in the morning. I was sitting behind the desk with a cup of coffee that had already gone cold. When I looked up, the thin glow was there again, slipping out from under the door and stretching across the carpet. This time, I didn't move. I just watched it. The light flickered slowly, the same way it always did, like someone inside was sitting in the dark, watching television. Minutes passed. Then something strange happened. The light dimmed suddenly, and the hallway became completely dark again. For a moment, nothing moved. Then I heard a sound, a very soft step, not loud enough to echo, just the gentle pressure of someone's weight shifting on carpet. It came from the end of the hallway. I sat perfectly still behind the desk. Another step followed, slow, careful. The sound moved a little closer. I couldn't see anything yet. The hallway lights were too dim, and the angle from the desk hid most of the floor, but I knew the sound was coming toward me. I remember holding my breath without even realizing it. The footsteps stopped halfway down the hallway. I waited. Nothing else happened. After maybe 20 seconds, the silence became so heavy that I forced myself to stand up. I told myself it was probably a guest who had come out of their room quietly. Maybe someone walking to the vending machine. That explanation felt normal enough. So I walked around the desk and looked down the hallway. Every door was closed. The carpet was empty, and room 12 was shut exactly the way it always was. I stood there for a long moment before slowly walking back to the desk. That night, I barely touched my phone. My eyes kept drifting back to the hallway every few minutes. Nothing else happened before the end of my shift, but the feeling stayed with me. The feeling that someone had been standing there in the dark, watching me. A week passed before anything else strange happened. By then, I had almost convinced myself I had imagined the footsteps too. Then, one night, while I was checking a late guest into a room, something interrupted us. The door chime behind the desk rang. It was the sound that plays whenever someone opens the front door, but the door hadn't opened. Both of us looked toward it at the same time. The glass door was still closed. The parking lot outside was empty. The guest gave a small laugh and said, "The sensor must be broken." I smiled politely and finished checking him in. But as he walked down the hallway with his key, I noticed something behind him. The door of room 12 was slightly open, not wide, just a small gap, enough to see darkness inside the room. My stomach tightened immediately. I knew I had locked that door earlier during my shift. The guest didn't notice it. He walked past the room and disappeared around the corner toward the far end of the building. I stayed behind the desk for a moment, staring at the open door. Part of me wanted to ignore it, but another part of me knew I couldn't just leave it like that. So after a minute, I picked up the master key again and started walking down the hallway. Each step felt slower than usual. The door to room 12 was still open when I reached it. The inside of the room was completely dark. I knocked lightly on the door frame. "Front desk," I said quietly. No answer came back. I pushed the door open a little further. The room looked the same as it had before. The bed was untouched. The curtains were closed. The parking lot outside was empty. The guest gave a small laugh and said the sensor must be broken. I smiled politely and finished checking him in. But as he walked down the hallway with his key, I noticed something behind him. The door of room 12 was slightly open, not wide, just a small gap, enough to see darkness inside the room. My stomach tightened immediately. I knew I had locked that door earlier during my shift. The guest didn't notice it. He walked past the room and disappeared around the corner toward the far end of the building. I stayed behind the desk for a moment, staring at the open door. Part of me wanted to ignore it, but another part of me knew I couldn't just leave it like that. So, after a minute, I picked up the master key again and started walking down the hallway. Each step felt slower than usual. The door to room 12 was still open when I reached it. The inside of the room was completely dark. I knocked lightly on the door frame. "Front desk," I said quietly. No answer came back. I pushed the door open a little further. The room looked the same as it had before. The bed was untouched. The curtains were closed. The air smelled stale and dusty. But this time, something felt different. The room felt warmer, not hot. After that night, I started avoiding the hallway as much as possible. Not in an obvious way. I still did my usual rounds, still checked the doors once during the night, like I was supposed to. But whenever I walked past room 12, I found myself looking straight ahead instead of at the door. It was easier that way, if I didn't look at it. it felt less real. For a while, nothing unusual happened. A few quiet nights passed, the kind of slow shifts where the hours drift by without anything memorable. Then one night, something changed. It was close to 3 in the morning. I remember the exact time because I had just glanced at the clock behind the desk. The highway outside had gone completely silent, and the building felt like it was holding its breath. That was when the security monitor flickered. The motel had 4 cameras, one pointed at the front desk, one at the parking lot, one at the side entrance, and one aimed down the hallway. Most of the time, I barely paid attention to them, but that night, the hallway camera caught my eye. The screen flickered once, then steadied. At first, everything looked normal. The carpet stretched down the corridor, the dim wall lights glowing softly above each door. Then I noticed something strange. The door to room 12 was open, just slightly. On the screen, it looked like a dark line cutting into the hallway. My chest tightened immediately. I knew I had locked that door earlier. I stared at the monitor for several seconds. Nothing moved. No shadow, no figure, just the open door. Finally, I stood up from the desk. The hallway felt longer than usual as I walked toward it. The quiet in the building had become so deep that I could hear the faint buzz of the lights overhead. When I turned the corner and looked down the corridor, the door to room 12 was closed, completely closed. I stopped walking. For a moment, I wondered if I had looked at the wrong room on the monitor. But as I reached for my coffee, something on the screen changed. A shadow passed across the hallway camera, slowly, like someone walking past the lens, except no one had walked past me. The shadow moved across the frame, then disappeared near the end of the hall, right where room 12 was. I leaned closer to the monitor. My heart was beating faster now. The hallway on the screen was empty again, but something about the darkness near that door felt different, almost thicker, like the camera couldn't quite capture what was standing there. A few seconds later, the image flickered again, and for a moment, just a single frame. I thought I saw someone standing in the hallway, tall, facing the camera, but the picture snapped back to normal before I could be sure. I sat there for a long time after that, long enough that the coffee beside me went completely cold. Eventually, I convinced myself it had just been a trick of the light, maybe a reflection from outside, maybe the camera lagging, but deep down, I knew something in that building had started behaving differently, and it didn't stop there. A few nights later, the phone behind the desk rang. That in itself wasn't unusual. Sometimes guests called the front desk for towels or directions, but when I answered, the line was silent. I waited for someone to speak. No voice came through, just a faint static sound. I was about to hang up when I heard something else, very quietly, breathing, slow, steady breathing on the other end of the line. I pulled the phone slightly away from my ear. "Hello?" I said again. The breathing stopped. The line went completely silent. Then the call disconnected. I stared at the phone for a moment. Then I checked the caller ID on the screen. The call had come from inside the building. Room 12. A chill ran through me immediately because I knew something about that room that the system didn't show. The phone inside it had been disconnected months ago. I kept staring at the phone for a long time after the call ended. Room 12. The number on the display was clear. There was no mistake. A strange feeling settled in my chest, the kind that makes you sit very still without realizing it. I slowly turned my head and looked down the hallway. Everything appeared normal. The carpet, the dim lights on the walls, the closed doors. Room 12 looked exactly the same as every other room. But now I knew the call had come from there. I stood up from the desk and walked to the booking computer. The screen still showed the same information it always had. Room 12, vacant. No guest checked in. No key issued. Nothing. For a moment, I considered calling my manager, but it was nearly 3 in the morning, and I already knew what she would say. She would probably tell me the phone system was old, that wires sometimes crossed, that calls could appear from the wrong rooms. It would sound logical, but it wouldn't explain the breathing I had heard on the line. I looked down the hallway again. The motel was silent. After a few minutes, I forced myself to sit back down. Eventually, the shift ended. The morning clerk arrived, and the strange feeling slowly faded as daylight filled the lobby windows. For the rest of the day, I almost convinced myself it had just been a weird glitch until my next night shift. That evening started normally. A couple of travelers checked in around 10, and a truck driver stopped by the vending machine before heading to his room. By midnight, the building had gone quiet again. I tried not to think about the phone call from the night before, but around 2 in the morning, the same uneasy feeling returned. It started with a sound, a faint click. I looked up from the desk. The hallway light near the end of the corridor flickered once. Then it steadied. Nothing else happened. I told myself it was probably just the old wiring again. But a few minutes later, the security monitor flickered. The hallway camera came back on, and the image made my stomach tighten. The door to room 12 was open again, wider this time. On the screen, the room looked completely dark. The inside of the doorway was just a rectangle of black. I watched the monitor for several seconds. No one stepped out. No shadow appeared. The door simply stayed open. My first instinct was to go close it again, but something stopped me, a strange hesitation that I couldn't explain. Instead, I kept watching the screen. The hallway remained empty, then the picture flickered slightly, and this time I noticed something that made my skin crawl. The darkness inside the doorway looked wrong. Not just dark, moving very slightly, like something inside the room was shifting. Slowly, the image flickered again. When it stabilized, the doorway was empty. The door had closed. I felt a cold shiver move down my back because I hadn't seen it close. One moment it was open, the next moment it was shut. I sat there for a while, staring at the screen. Eventually, I stood up and walked down the hallway again. The air in the corridor felt cooler than usual. When I reached room 12, the door was closed exactly the way it should have been. I touched the handle. Locked. For a moment, I just stood there listening. The building was silent. But then I heard something. A faint sound from inside the room. Not footsteps. Not movement. Breathing. Very slow breathing. I stepped away from the door immediately. My heart was beating faster now. For several seconds, I stood there in the hallway, unsure what to do. Finally, I turned around and walked back to the desk. I didn't check the room again that night, and I didn't mention it to anyone the next day. But after that shift, something about the motel changed. The quiet no longer felt peaceful. It felt watchful, like the building itself was aware of me. The next strange thing happened 3 nights later. I was sitting behind the desk when I noticed movement on the security monitor. Not in the hallway, in the parking lot. A figure was standing near the edge of the lot, under one of the tall lamps. At first, I assumed it was a guest who had stepped outside, but the longer I looked, the stranger it felt. The person wasn't moving. They were just standing there, facing the motel. The distance made it impossible to see their face clearly, just a tall shape under the light. I kept watching the screen. Minutes passed. The figure didn't move. Finally, I stood up and walked toward the front door to look outside. The moment I stepped into the doorway and looked toward the lamp, the parking lot was empty. No one was there. I stepped outside and looked around. The road was quiet. The night air felt still. There was nowhere for someone to hide. I went back inside slowly. When I glanced at the monitor again, the parking lot camera was normal, empty. But the hallway camera had changed. A shadow stood halfway down the corridor, tall, perfectly still. facing the front desk. I turned immediately and looked toward the hallway with my own eyes. It was empty. When I looked back at the screen, the shadow was gone. That was the moment I realized something I hadn't considered before. Whatever was happening, it didn't always exist in the same place at the same time. Sometimes it appeared on the cameras. Sometimes it appeared in the hallway. Sometimes it appeared outside. And sometimes it seemed to be standing somewhere in between, watching, waiting, and always near room 12. The next night, I couldn't bring myself to sit at the desk like usual. Something inside me had shifted. A quiet dread had settled in my chest that I couldn't ignore. I decided I would check room 12 again, carefully, slowly, step by step. It was nearly 3 in the morning. The hallway lights flickered faintly as I walked toward the room. Each step made the carpet beneath my feet feel heavier than it was. The air seemed cooler here, almost damp, like the room itself was breathing. When I reached the door, it was slightly ajar again. I froze. My fingers itched to reach for the handle, but I couldn't move. There was something about the darkness inside the room that didn't feel normal. It wasn't just the absence of light. It seemed to pulse, almost as if it were alive. Slowly, I leaned forward and peeked inside. The bed was perfectly made. The curtains were drawn. Everything looked ordinary, but on the far side of the room, I saw movement. Not fast, not sudden. A figure crouched in the corner, so dark that I could barely see the edges of it against the shadows. It didn't move its head. It didn't breathe visibly. It simply waited, watching me. I stepped back instinctively. Then the door clicked shut behind me. I spun around. The hallway was empty. No sound except my own ragged breathing. I tried the handle. Locked. For a moment, I thought I was imagining it, that my exhaustion had conjured something from shadows and fear. Then a whisper, soft, almost inaudible. My front desk. I froze. The voice wasn't coming from the hallway. It wasn't coming from the room. At least, not in a way I could pinpoint. It seemed to surround me, echoing softly, just behind my ears. My hands shook. I wanted to run, but my legs wouldn't move. The whisper came again. Why do you see me? I couldn't answer. My throat felt tight. Then a second sound, the soft shuffle of fabric, slow and deliberate. Something moving just inside the room again. I forced myself to look at the door. The darkness inside seemed denser, thicker, and in it, I could now just barely make out two faint shapes. They weren't moving like humans, not like the truck driver guests or any person I had ever seen. They seemed to flow, almost liquid, stretching slightly toward the light of the hallway before retreating back into the shadows. My heartbeat hammered in my chest. I wanted to leave, wanted to run down the hallway and never look back, but something, some force I couldn't explain, kept me rooted there. Then, the room grew warmer. The air felt heavy, pressing against my skin. A slow, deliberate sound, the turning of the doorknob from the inside. I could see it very clearly through the gap in the door. Slowly, the knob turned. The door began to open, and I could hear it now, clearer than ever, breathing, deep, deliberate, not like a human. I couldn't move. I couldn't scream. And then the whisper came again. Finally. The door opened fully, but nothing stepped out. Instead, the darkness itself seemed to spill into the hallway, thick and black, curling like smoke along the carpet, reaching toward me. I fell back against the wall. My mind screamed to run, but my body refused. The shadow stretched toward the front desk. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, it vanished. Everything went silent again. I was shaking. Sweat ran down my face. The hallway looked empty. Room 12 was closed, locked. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. I didn't move from the desk until the sun began to rise. And when morning came, I found the remote from room 12 sitting on the counter in front of me. Not where it should have been, but in plain view, warm, still warm. I never touched room 12 again. I quit the motel soon after. I told myself it was better to leave than to stay and find out what it really was. But even now, years later, I sometimes see that shadow in my dreams. I sometimes wake in the middle of the night, hearing faint whispers, soft clicks, and the slow turning of a door handle. And I know it's still there, waiting.